Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So here I am in London at 10 Kensington Church Walk, and behind me is the house where Ezra Pound lived from 1909 until 1914 at least. So he lived upstairs in one of the drawing rooms. I'm not sure which floor it was on. It was owned by a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Langley, when he was here. He thought they were the finest people in England. Anyhow, Ezra Pound was a poet whose work is deeply out of fashion, but principally because he was an unrepentant fascist after the Second World War and indeed to the day he died. So there's this plain silly belief that just because you find somebody's political views rebarbative, therefore you must think that their artistry is craftless. Likewise, it would be equally ludicrous to think that just because someone's opinions accord entirely with your own, that you must think that this person's work has artistic merit. But as it happens, I reject his poetry on solely literary grounds. I used to read it quite a bit when I was a teenager, so I certainly gave him a chance. When I was a schoolboy, his cantos, which seemed quite degenerate to me. He was an imagist. Anyway, Ezra Pound was born in Idaho, in the United States. Back then, Idaho was a territory. It wasn't even a state. Only became a state a little bit later. So his family later moved to Pennsylvania, and that's where he grew up. Went to a number of schools run by women, dame schools they were called, a military school where he had to wear an American Civil War era uniform. So he was of English stock through and through, so far as I can tell. His family had arrived from the British Isles in the United States, or what later became the United States, in the 17th century. His father was something in the land registry, but they seem to have had quite a bit of money. So he went to the University of Pennsylvania, which prefers not to remember him, and he went on an extensive European tour just after the turn of the century. So he's a very well-travelled chap. So then he was an undergraduate, but he was always getting into scrapes with the authorities, and he didn't like what was on the reading list. He was going to plough his own furrow, and he claimed to have acquired a working knowledge of 9 languages. I'm not quite sure how true that was, but he was a highly eccentric and colourful character. So then he decided to move to Europe. He spent some time in Gibraltar, that British-owned peninsula on the coast of Spain. It's only about 5 miles long, but it's 7 miles from Morocco. It's a choke point controlling access to the Mediterranean, and he regularly took ferries across to Tangier, Morocco, and he acted as a tour guide to American tourists in Gibraltar. So he had a chance to brush up his languages. So then he came to London in 1909, and he decided this was the place to be for literary inspiration, for writing in poetry in the English language, because probably more so than any other, surely Anglophone city, this was the literary heart and brain. Because of course New York was probably the second biggest Anglophone city, but perhaps didn't have quite as much of a literary scene as London did, because of course this is the birthplace of the language. Anyway, he rejected Victorian writers like Rudyard Kipling and Lord Tennyson, though he had appreciated their work. This is a new era, and he felt that you shouldn't be moralizing in verse or trying to preach universal truths. He ought to find his own voice and express his experiences. So he moved on to being an imagist, not being so tightly bound by metre or indeed rhyme, which many held to be the principal enrichment of poesy in the English tongue. So he wrote, what was it, Exaltations. He wrote about, well, his experiences, his thoughts. Not narrative poems, not very much. Occasionally a little bit sentimental. He'd fallen in love with a young woman in the United States who'd rejected him. When he came here, he married a British woman, Miss, I think it was Dorothy, if I got the right, Shakespeare, but no E on the end of Shakespeare, and I don't believe she was related to the poet. Well, the playwright, really. So they had one daughter, if I got that right, Olga. Anyway, he moved out of here. He'd lived at a number of other London addresses, Langham Street, across the street from the Yorkshire Grey pub, but there's no plaque there. So the First World War came along, and he became bitterly disillusioned with that. He thought the war was unnecessary. He said it was caused by high finance, by money lenders, war profiteers, and this led inexorably to anti-Semitism, which I don't think he espoused until after the First World War. So then he shifted to Paris in 1921, which was starting to recover from the horrors of the First World War. So he felt sort of let down by democracy, by mass unemployment, by people's failure to take the threat of communism seriously, which he thought was utterly Philistine. And then he moved to Italy because he liked Mussolini's fascist government, which he said was young, was virile, was actually solving problems, reducing unemployment, and so on. So that was the way forward. Now, fascism was not as bitterly unpopular in the 1920s as it is today. The full horror of it was not apparent at the time. Now, Mussolini's forces were soon carrying out atrocities in Libya, but these weren't reported in Europe back then. Obviously, the horrors of the Soviet Union were becoming public knowledge. The labor camps, the famines deliberately created, the industrial scale use of torture, mass executions without trial, things like that. And some people from Russia, the Ukraine and so forth, fleeing to Europe, telling tales of the barbarities of Soviet baboonry. Anyhow, so later in 1924, he moved once again to Italy, lived in Rapallo for a while, lived in a number of different places around Italy, and as I say, he became an outspoken admirer of Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, and an indefatigable advocate of fascism, which he said was the way forward to solve social problems. Anyway, so Mussolini, who spoke quite good English, was a fan of his poetry, which was very much for the movement. And so he was there. The Second World War broke out. Of course, the United States was neutral at first, but December 1941, the United States got involved, and indeed it was a war against Italy. But he was not interned. He made himself as useful as possible to the fascist government in Italy, broadcasting to the United States wartime propaganda, trying to dispirit Americans, trying to drive a wedge between them and their other allies, and on, saying they were fighting for communism, that fascism was good. And there were many anti-Semitic screeds from Ezra Pound, and he was denouncing Franklin Delano Roosevelt for being woeful, for being a willing instrument of the Jews, exposing the fact that he was confined to a wheelchair. Obviously, that didn't reflect any discredit on him, but some people were very prejudiced against those who were physically disabled at the time. And the American media was incredibly deferential, for some reason would never state the fact that FDR was wheelchair-bound. Because he would address public meetings from a seated position. You always stand to speak to a public meeting. And there are photos of FDR and Churchill sitting down on a warship singing a hymn. Everybody behind them is standing. Of course, you stand to sing a hymn. And I don't know how the penny didn't drop or the public didn't click. There was no law against saying that FDR was in a wheelchair, but the media just didn't say anything, and somehow a lot of the public didn't figure it out till long after he died. Anyway, so back to Pound. So he was arrested by the US Army right after the Second World War in Italy. He was held in a cage outdoors for 3 weeks, which seems to have played havoc for his mental state, perhaps a bit of a kook as it was. It seemed to be a fairly cruel thing to do. Not that his cause wasn't cruel, it was. And he was completely impenitent about fascism, despite the full-scale evil of the Holocaust and all that being apparent. Anyway, he was put on trial. He was charged with high treason, so he was standing trial for his life. But according to the Norton rules, he was found guilty but insane. Well, I don't know if they call them the Norton rules in the United States. He was sectioned, and he was detained at a psychiatric hospital in the United States for 12 years. Then he was set at liberty. He immediately took a ship to Italy, and he landed there, and he lived out the rest of his days. Didn't have many friends, still attended some fascist gatherings, and was still giving that salute. So he was hardly ever published after that. He was buried at Isola di Michele, off the coast of Italy. I think it's kind of near the Bay of Naples, where Stravinsky and Diaghilev are laid to rest there. So yeah, he's not widely appreciated now. I think he's fairly dreadful, actually, but he was certainly different. I should have said that when he was here in London, he knew many people in the literary scene, including those of left-wing sympathies. James Joyce, T.S. Eliot were friends of his. He knew Ford Madox Ford, and then Jerome K. Jerome he knew slightly. It was just before he died, and I can't think who else he knew. I think Yeats, I'm fairly sure he met Shaw. Some of these people lived around here. Rupert Brooke reviewed his work that was dreadful. That was short before Brooke died. And not too far away, Siegfried Sassoon, only about half a mile over that way. All right, so that is enough about Ezra Pound. So he lived in this delightful little nook off Kensington Church Street. I shall switch it off now. Toodle pip.